I'm now really pleased to say we have Luba Fein from Israel. She is an abolitionist activist promoting the Nordic model in her country, Israel, where it came into force recently. She's also a volunteer for a UK-based feminist NGO, Filia, and she's going to talk to us about a gender ideologists crusade against the Nordic model. Thank you so much for coming on, Luba, and over to you.
The gender ideology and pro-prostitution lobby crusade. Have you ever noticed that the gender ideologists are extremely hostile towards the sex trade abolitionists like me? Most of you surely have, and the signs are everywhere. Can you see this? By the way, you can buy this pin for £2 if you want. That's what I have seen on Google. So these struggles are so intertwined that for the most part, the people who are emotionally invested in one of them will be invested in another one as well. For example, I was called TERF due to my support for the Nordic model long before I realized there is a contradiction between the gender ideology and feminism. Only then I made the Google search to realize who are TERFs, and then I found out that they actually have good arguments, right? So today I want to discuss two topics. One of them is the crusade of the pro-prostitution lobby in Israel, and that the gender ideologists support, and the theoretical basis of this interplay between pro-prostitution ideology and gender ideology, which is maybe it is intuitively understood but not discussed enough. So now, very, very briefly, historical context, because we already discussed it here. Israeli abolitionism began as a struggle of a handful of women against the human trafficking epidemic that escalated during the 90s. In 2000, a former Knesset parliament member, Zehava Gal'on, set up the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee to fight against sex trafficking. In 2006, the new anti-trafficking legislation was enforced. In 2008, in nine, the same MP proposed a sex purchase ban bill. After numerous changes in the content of the law and the list of its supporters, Israeli lawmakers eventually outlawed the purchase of sex in 2018. The enforcement only began in February 2021. So between the 2008 and 2018, the abolitionist coalition established exit services and promoted some anti-sex trade regulation, less controversial maybe. What I want to say now, that in every country that passed the sex purchase ban before, there was a social and political struggle between the supporters of the law and its organized opponents. You can learn about some of the struggles in the book by Norwegian feminists Trine Korsvik and Anne Stowe. So in every country this book discusses, you will find politicians and the civil society NGOs supporting and opposing the Nordic model. But in Israel, the struggle emerged differently. The sex purchase ban was highly controversial across all parts of Israeli society, but the opponents of the Nordic model did not organize until the end of 2018. It was too close to the law's passage, so nothing much could be changed then. By the end of 2018, very close to the actual passing of the law, the first buds of organized opposition to the Nordic model began. Before we elaborate on that, I do not think that the change should or can happen without organized resistance or any resistance. The Nordic model threatens the social norm that many men have adopted. It threatens a multi-million industry. So it is unlikely that a small group of women will say, well, now it's over, and everyone will just nod their heads. It won't happen. Therefore, both sides, we and the other side, we must manage public debate, respond to each other's allegations, and sometimes stop and check ourselves. Are we still right? So I accept the existence of this opposition. Anyway, between 2018 and 2020, the anti-Nordic model lobby was established. Toward the end of 2018, a group of people founded the argument Who.Men in the sex industry organization. So this organization promotes a sex workers' work ideology, and according to them, the purchase of sex is legitimate consumer activity. In 2019, they were registered as a non-profit. One comment, the activists between this NGO are not exclusively people in the sex industry. The organization has 11 founders. To my best knowledge, more than half have no connection to the sex trade. Of this, 4 are women from academia with PhD degrees, some of whom perform research related to the sex industry. I find it hypocritical when upper middle class people who would never prostitute themselves, not even for a short time out of curiosity or as a part of their research, they insist that prostitution is a job. They know prostitution is not a job. They just believe that it's acceptable for people who are not of their social class, right? Anyway, their activism is still within legitimate limits. It is legitimate for every person to hold any opinion on prostitution. I only find it dishonest to present activism of very privileged people as activism of sex workers. It could have been called sex workers and allies, but they called it sex workers speaking. And this phenomenon is familiar to us worldwide, and we could expect it in Israel. Everywhere we have middle-class people who are acting against the Nordic model and insisting they're just listening to sex workers, but they're not just listening, they're loud and dominant in government and local authority meetings. They organize protests and they represent the sex workers at conferences that happen. Their behavior is often intimidating. The NGO argument did not stay alone for long, and the other players joined them. You can see on the slide. One, Ma'avarim, in Hebrew, transitions. This is an NGO for people on trans spectrum, transgender rights NGO, a veteran organization that exists since 2010. It had a different purpose and became very dominant in the struggle against the Nordic model. Project Gila for the trans empowerment, registered in 2011 for the purpose of promotion of justice and transgender rights. Transiot Israel, which is Trans Women of Israel, established in 2020 with the purpose of empowerment of the trans community. And the informal organization, Israel Strippers Union, established to fight against the closure of the strip clubs. The Norwegians called this phenomenon the crusade of the pro-prostitution lobby. I borrowed their terms because I liked it. So how did they look? How did it look in Israel, the crusade? First, they created the Schrodinger's prostitute. I call it this way. Schrodinger's prostitute is someone who is, on the one hand, strong, earning well, and chose prostitution out of many alternatives, but on the other hand, will die if sex purchase ban is enforced. She does not suffer from any trauma of prostitution. She eats Pimps and Johns for breakfast, but under the sex purchase ban, all her clients will turn violent, and she will have to work underground. And this rhetoric of the pro-prostitution lobby already uses one of those two figures, depending on the context. The other strategy was Intimidation Campaign. In December 2018, the transgender group Ma'avarim published a position paper which stated that the sex purchase ban was a death sentence for the trans community in Israel. This hyperbolic statement was repeated again and again in the social and in the mainstream media. Death sentence against the trans community. Thank God the law passed and no one died. Good, right? The pro-prostitution lobby made 3 appeals to the Supreme Court. One, against the Web Blocking Act. We have an act that, according to which we can block virtual brothels. So the appeal was made by 9 women who advertised on prostitution websites. The main argument was the freedom of occupation, which is interesting that the website owners did not join this appeal, only the women did. In last year, the Supreme Court recommended they withdraw this appeal to avoid the ruling against them. 2020, an appeal against the sex purchase ban by trans women of Israel to the Supreme Court. The main argument was the trans community's dependence on prostitution for a living. Again, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal for technical reasons. 2021, an appeal against the decision of the state attorney to define lap dance as prostitution. In Israel, such a ruling exists. 2 individual women from the Israeli Strippers Union. Again, the main argument was freedom of occupation. And the strip club's owners didn't join this appeal. The same tactic. Women are in the front, the pimps are hiding. Few months later, the High Court rejected this appeal as well. There were also attempts to convince the lawmakers and the policymakers to delay the law, apparently to bury it later. The lobby attended the parliament committees, met with policymakers, distributed position papers. In this domain, the freedom of occupation argument was not mentioned. The strategy was to convince the decision makers that we should get additional budgets for exit and rehabilitation under the sex purchase ban, and the budget didn't reach on time. So the community of sex workers, they depend on this money, and the law should be delayed until all the budgets are reached. So they did not argue that prostitution is a legitimate job, but instead there was not enough support for people who exit prostitution, especially the trans people. Now there is a loophole. We did have an extensive array of aid NGOs in 2018, but we will always need more assistance for survivors, right? This population needs every thread of help that we can get. So the pro-prostitution lobby, they tried to create a never-ending excuse to delay the law because there is never enough support. This was clearly dishonest because the Israeli Task Force on Human Trafficking and Prostitution appealed to the Supreme Court against the Ministry of Welfare and Social Affairs and demanded that the extra budget be transferred ASAP to aid and support NGOs. They managed to speed up the money transfers for exit and rehabilitation. But the pro-prostitution lobby did not join this appeal. They never joined this appeal. They did not care about the budget. They just used it as a bargaining chip. Anyway, there were another attempts to stop the law. For example, the pro-prostitution lobby gained support from Netanyahu's Minister of Interior Security. His name is Amir Ohana. Remember this name. He is an alt-right politician, and he had the actual power to delay the law. Thanks to him, the enforcement of the sex purchase ban only began last year. So they did delay it. So remember this when someone blames TERFs and SWERFs for collaborating with the far rights. Okay, so how did Israeli society react to the pro-sex trade lobby? Many people in my country, including some Nordic Model activists, do not understand why the sex purchase ban is still controversial. I think that some people are naive. Many people ask why some women in the sex industry oppose the sex purchase ban. It is good for them. And why people who claim to help those women attack the Nordic model. And the elephant in the room is the transgender activists' opposition to the sex purchase ban. What is interesting is that transgender is probably the only demographic in the world, not just in Israel, who with 100% support for the legalized sex trade. And why? So how Israelis explain the crusade of the pro-prostitution lobby in general and the support by trans community in particular? So one argument is the women in the sex industry who believe that in sex work is work, probably they are very privileged prostitutes. This is not true. No woman in prostitution is privileged. Believe me, I know. Let's not create our version of Schrodinger's prostitute. But many women in prostitution use denial as a coping strategy. This phenomenon exists among other victims of trauma, such as violent relationships. Another argument, opponents of the Nordic model have not yet realized that we are expanding our aid and rehabilitation NGOs, and the law brings more budget. This is not true. The NGOs and rehabilitation, not a game changer for the pro-prostitution lobby. Let's forget it. Another assumption, opponents of the Nordic model did not understand yet how much suffering there is in the sex industry. We will explain them. Also, I don't think so. We have enough pieces of evidence of suffering in the sex trade. If you want it, you will find it. And also many people are appalled about the position of the trans rights NGOs and individuals. According to the data these organizations themselves distribute, most murders of trans people are in the sex industry. So it is difficult to understand how one can be trans activist without being an abolitionist. So some people explain the trans community is too dependent on prostitution for employment. And maybe this is partly true, but this is not a likely explanation because the majority of the trans people is not engaged in prostitution. And second, dependence on prostitution for employment cannot explain the sweeping opposition to abolitionism. Around the world, you will find extremely marginalized communities, poor women in South Africa, South America, Maori women in New Zealand, indigenous women in Canada, all overrepresented in the sex trade, but they are angry about this. And they have prominent abolitionist sex trade survivor-led organizations. We know them. Another excuse for the trans community, that the trans community is attracted to the sex trade because only there are trans women treated as real women. Okay, this is bullshit. In recent years, there has been a lot of tension between feminists and trans activists. We know it, right? And the topic is whether you are defined by biological sex or by your gender identity. And we are attacked for seeing our biological sex as our denominator. But in these terms, the sex industry is the most transphobic place in the universe, right? Neither pimps nor Johns respect the concept of gender identity. Johns buy bodies, they buy our bodies. They know what sex they want, and they know what race, age, and breast size they want. They don't care how you identify. They don't ever expect our identity as human being, forget about sex. So the brothels are full of TERFs and swerves. They're run by TERFs, they're visited by TERFs. Okay, so how did the crusade of the pro-prostitution lobby emerge, and why do the gender ideologists support it? I see the reframing of the sex industry as a kind of acceptable job for destitute women as part of a broad neoliberal and anti-feminist ideology. I will talk about this now. I will try to do it quickly. Throughout its existence, feminism fought for women's liberation from oppression. Sometimes it faced backlashes. The common denominator of those backlashes was that women should sacrifice for the common good, right? For example, women worked during the Second World War, and after the war, they were sent back home to vacate jobs for men because it was good for the family. Women have always insisted that their needs are not less crucial than their oppressors. But these were minor manipulations compared to what postmodernism brought us. Postmodernism is the school of thought that denies epistemic certainty and stable meaning of ideas and things. Under postmodernism, there is no truth, just different discourses. And this is useless for feminist struggle. Why should we dedicate our life to changing society if there is no truth? We just pick our favorite discourse and love it. So the notion of not truth disintegrates the feminist movement. A group struggling against its oppression must have a common understanding of goals, oppressions, narratives, of what is good and bad. Even so, our truth has constantly been challenged in the past, right? But in the past, the backlash was like shooting at a house, and we built forts to defend ourselves. Now it's like termites eating our walls, and we cannot see them until the house collapses. You can only hear them gnawing in the wall at night, but you are sleeping and you ignore them. Under postmodernism, all the oppressions we had in the past are framed as empowerment. Everything is feminism. The basic assumptions of feminism have been redefined. Once upon a time, feminists called to listen and believe women, to give a voice to their pain. Now, neoliberal feminism demands to listen women in the situation of abductees who write from captivity, the captives treat me well. So these voices now are proof that women are happy. You know it, right? Many women who live with a violent partner, they don't complain. Many women in prostitution say, leave me alone, I am okay. Sometimes the captivity is actual, sometimes it is economic or psychological, but no one makes an effort to rescue the woman from captivity because everyone is comfortable that she remains a prisoner, and we don't have spent a fortune on rescue and ransom. Anyway, does neoliberal feminism promote completely random cliches? I do not think so. We can see that mainstream feminism still fighting many misogynistic practices that are not profitable. Domestic violence, not profitable. Murder of women, not profitable. Rape is not profitable. The oppression becomes choice and empowerment only when it makes money. The plastic surgery industry, the fashion, cosmetics, sex industry, all of them are pouring capital into deep pockets. Not of the women, of course, they're consumers or in products. And today it is increasingly difficult to criticize those industries. You judge women who chose all this response for any criticism. Remember what I said about the house eaten by the termites? The women who set boundaries do not produce enough profit. Neoliberal feminism undermines women's boundaries. If your boundaries are violated, you will more income. The plastic surgery industries, they thrive on undermining body integrity, as do the sex industries. And another postmodern ideology is gender ideology. This ideology assumes, for example, that every person has a sex and gender identity. Gender identity sometimes does not match your sex, and the problem can be perfectly fixed by lifelong surgical and hormonal treatments. You will look a little bit more like another sex. Have you noticed? Once again, the plastic surgery industry, which is not the most ethical industry globally, it offers expensive solutions to psychological problems caused by the society. And anyone who believes wholeheartedly in this ideology will never be able to adopt the principles of abolitionism, because what do we abolitionists say? That our boundaries are essential. Our boundaries are essential both emotionally and physically. Nobody can touch our body without genuine consent. Conscious detachment from the body or dissociation is one of the severest damages of prostitution. One must be cured out of it to begin to recover. So how can this belief be combined with this cliche that your body is wrong and your body is hated? What can, when we abolitionists call for connecting to the body, abandoning the dissociation, putting boundaries, we trigger a person in such distress. So we automatically become enemies. Another problem with the gender ideology is the attempt to rebrand our oppression as identity. What does gender ever mean? This is a polite word for sex, and this is in sociology, it is the allocation of social roles by sex. Sometimes they're harmless roles, like wearing pink and blue, but most often they are practices of oppression of women and superiority of men. A woman works for free and taken for granted, and the man performs paid work. And there are also extremes like gender violence, domestic violence, or prostitution. In gender ideology, gender is an identity, a deep psychological feeling, which cannot be clearly defined, of course. So what does it actually mean, female gender identity? It means that someone identifies with the roles that society assigns to women. And it can be as harmless as wearing a dress and destructive like prostitution. But these are two very complicated connections between the two ideologies. But I think that devotion of trans activists to the crusade of the prostitution lobby can be much simpler as well. For example, many people in my country and abroad emphasize the trans community dependence on prostitution earnings, but nobody dares to say that unlike women, trans-identified men are visibly present at every vertex of the triangle: pimp, sex buyer, prostitute. In Trafficking in Persons report, each one of them, and also the last one, see the page 310, which is a part about Israel, and it says, some transgender children as young as 13 years old, forget the very dubious term transgender children, but this is what they say. Many of them run away from home, come under the mentorship of transgender women in commercial sex, and sometimes these mentors exploit transgender children in commercial sex. And it is in the Trafficking in Persons report, and nobody dares to say it. There might be even a simpler explanation for this blind support of trans rights activists for the sex industry, like the basic identification with their sex group and its needs. Many people identify more with their own demography. Who said this feeling of empathy is calculated and not inherent? Who said it disappears when you claim some different identity? So my last two arguments are not heard in Israel and elsewhere only for one reason. We put the integrity of the mechanism that make money above the truth, above humanity, above women's right to dignity and well-being. Postmodernism and gender ideology have an enormous contribution to all of this.